You wake up, you check your phone before you check on anyone else, you eat alone in a car, you sleep in a locked room, in a locked house, on a street full of strangers you will never speak to. This feels normal to you. It felt normal to your parents. It has felt normal for maybe 3 or 4 generations. But for nearly 200,000 years before that, none of it would have made any sense at all. Your ancestors lived by a different code. Not a written one, a felt one. Rules so deep they were never questioned, because questioning them could get you killed. And if you were dropped into that world tomorrow, with your modern mind intact, you would not last a week. Not because you're weak, because you'd break every rule without even knowing you were breaking it. Here are 10 of them. See how many you could actually survive. The first rule is simple. You do not eat until everyone eats. Anthropologists studying modern hunter-gatherer bands, like the Hadza of Tanzania, have documented this again and again. A successful hunter does not walk into camp and quietly feast on his own kill. He hands it over. It gets divided, often by someone other than the hunter himself, so that no one can be accused of favoring their own family. The best cut doesn't go to the strongest man. It gets shared so evenly that anthropologist Kristen Hawkes, who spent years studying the Hadza, found that a great hunter often ends up eating less meat than an average one because the meat is dispersed across so many households. Why would anyone hunt then if the reward gets taken away? Because the real reward wasn't the meat. It was status. It was trust. It was the quiet knowledge that when your luck ran out, someone would feed you too. Now, imagine explaining that to a modern person. Imagine telling someone today that their salary, their bonus, their promotion should be split evenly among their coworkers the moment they earn it. You'd be laughed out of the room. Modern life rewards accumulation. Ancient life punished it. Hoarding food while others starved wasn't just rude. It was a threat to the group's survival, and groups have never tolerated threats to their own survival for long. The second rule follows naturally from the first. You do not outshine the group. There's a phenomenon researchers call leveling, and it shows up in nearly every documented forager society on Earth. If someone gets too proud, too boastful, too eager to remind everyone how skilled they are, the group cuts them down, sometimes with mockery, sometimes with silence, sometimes, in more extreme cases, with exile. Anthropologist Christopher Boehm spent decades studying this pattern and called it a reverse dominance hierarchy. In most primate groups, the strongest individual dominates the rest. In human forager bands, it flips. The group dominates anyone who tries to dominate them. Bragging isn't confidence, it's a warning sign. Compare that to now. Modern culture is built on self-promotion, personal brands, highlight reels. The entire architecture of social media rewards the loudest voice in the room. Somewhere in the last few thousand years, humans went from punishing arrogance to monetizing it. Your ancestors would not recognize the version of confidence you're taught to admire. To them, it would look like a man standing in the middle of camp, shouting about how much better he is than everyone else, while the whole group quietly decided he was becoming a liability. The third rule is about children, and it might be the hardest one for a modern person to accept. A child was never raised by 2 parents alone. Anthropologist Sarah Blaffer-Hrdy has spent much of her career studying what she calls cooperative breeding in early human societies. Human infants are extraordinarily needy compared to other primates. They can't cling to their mothers the way baby chimpanzees can. They can't walk for over a year. Hrdy's research suggests this level of dependency simply could not have been managed by one mother alone, and it likely couldn't have been managed by 2 parents either. It took a network. Grandmothers, aunts, older siblings, even unrelated adults in the band. A baby might be held, fed, and soothed by a dozen different people before it ever learned to speak. Now picture a modern parent trying to explain postpartum depression, burnout, or the isolation of raising a child inside a small apartment with no nearby family to an ancient mother who was never, not once, left alone with an infant for more than a few minutes. She would not understand the loneliness. She would ask where everyone went. The fourth rule concerns violence, and here the myth needs breaking a little. Ancient life is often imagined as endlessly peaceful, all cooperation, no conflict. That is not quite true. But the way violence worked was different, and in some ways, stricter. In small, tightly bound bands, killing a member of your own group was almost unthinkable, because the group's survival depended on every set of hands. Anthropologist Napoleon Chagnon, who studied the Yanomamo in the Amazon, documented real and sometimes brutal conflict between different bands. But within a band, the rules were far more rigid. You did not attack the people you depended on to share food, defend the camp, or care for your children if you died. Betrayal from within was treated as one of the gravest offenses a person could commit, because there was nowhere to escape to, no police to call, no new town to move to, just the same 20 or 30 faces, day after day, for the rest of your life. A modern person used to walking away from a bad job, a bad neighborhood, a bad relationship, and simply starting over somewhere new would find this suffocating. There was no starting over. There was only the group you were born into, and the group you might be exiled from if you broke its trust. The fifth rule is about privacy, or rather, the total absence of it. You did not sleep alone. You did not eat alone. You rarely, if ever, had a private thought that stayed private for long, because life happened in the open, inside a camp where everyone could see everyone else at almost every hour of the day. Modern humans crave solitude. We lock doors. We wear headphones in public specifically to signal, "Do not talk to me." Ancient humans had almost none of that architecture. A hut wall might separate you from the rain, but it rarely separated you from the group's awareness of your business. Illness, grief, conflict, love, all of it played out with an audience. Because there was no alternative. Try explaining to a modern teenager that their diary, their group chat, their late-night phone calls, all of it would have been conducted within earshot of an entire village. There would have been no secrets, not really, just things everyone politely pretended not to have heard. The sixth rule involves food, and it might be one of the strangest to modern ears. You ate what was available, not what you wanted. There was no cuisine of personal preference. If the group found tubers, you ate tubers. If a hunt failed for 3 days, you were hungry for 3 days, alongside everyone else. Nutritional anthropologists have found extraordinary variation in ancient diets depending on season, geography, and luck, but very little variation within a group at any given moment. Everyone ate roughly the same thing, because everyone shared the same pool of resources. There was no separate meal for the picky eater. There was no sending food back. There was only what the land gave, divided among the people who depended on each other to find more of it tomorrow. A modern grocery store, with its aisles of infinite choice, would likely overwhelm an ancient mind entirely, not because it's confusing, but because the very idea of choosing food based on preference, rather than availability, would seem almost absurd, a kind of luxury with no precedent. The seventh rule concerns work, and this one might surprise you the most. Ancient life was not endless labor. Anthropologist Marshall Solins, in his influential essay on what he called the original affluent society, argued that many hunter-gatherer groups worked significantly fewer hours per week than modern people do. Once you account for the full workweek of employment, commuting, chores, and errands, food gathering might take a few hours a day. The rest of the time was social, storytelling, rest, play, teaching children. Ancient humans were not, as popular imagination often suggests, locked in a constant desperate struggle for survival every waking hour. In good seasons, in stable environments, there was actually more unstructured time than a modern office worker sees in a month. What there wasn't was rest without purpose. Idle time was almost always social time. You didn't scroll alone on a couch. You sat with people. The leisure was shared because nearly everything was shared. A modern person's idea of relaxing, alone, in silence, staring at a screen, would have looked to an ancient human less like rest and more like a kind of quiet isolation they had no word for. The eighth rule is about death and how close it lived to daily life. Children died. Often. Infant mortality in ancient populations is estimated by many researchers to have been staggeringly high by modern standards, in some estimates approaching a third or more of children not surviving to adulthood. Death was not hidden away in hospitals or funeral homes. It happened in camp, among the living, witnessed by children from a young age. Grief was communal, expressed openly, sometimes through elaborate ritual, sometimes through practical necessity, because a group in mourning still had to eat that day. A modern parent, surrounded by pediatric medicine, vaccines, and emergency care that has pushed child mortality down to a tiny fraction of what it once was, would find the ancient experience of parenthood almost unbearable to imagine. And yet, ancient parents loved just as fiercely. They simply carried a kind of daily uncertainty that modern life has, mercifully, mostly erased. The ninth rule involves belief, and how little space there was for doubt. Ritual bound the group together, and stepping outside of it wasn't really an option. Archaeologist Ian Hodder, known for his long-term excavation work at the Neolithic site of Çatalhöyük, has argued that shared symbolic practice, buried skulls beneath house floors, painted walls. Communal ritual functioned as social glue every bit as important as food sharing. You didn't choose your beliefs the way a modern person browses ideas online, testing this philosophy, discarding that one. You were born into a symbolic world, and questioning it too loudly wasn't seen as intellectual curiosity. It was seen as a threat to the cohesion the entire group depended on. A modern person raised on the idea that spiritual belief is a private, personal, endlessly negotiable choice would find themselves genuinely stunned by how little that framework existed in the deep past. Belief wasn't a preference, it was infrastructure. The 10th and final rule might be the hardest of all to accept, because it touches something modern people hold as almost sacred: individual identity. In small ancient bands, you were not primarily an individual. You were a role, a daughter, a hunter, a firekeeper. Your worth was measured by your usefulness to the group, not by some private inner sense of self-actualization. There was no concept of finding yourself, because the self was never really separated from the group in the first place. Psychologists studying self-construal across cultures have found that this collective orientation, rather than the individualistic one so dominant in modern Western life, was likely the ancestral default for most of human history. The idea of a person defined primarily by personal goals, personal happiness, personal branding, is, in the timeline of the species, astonishingly new. So here you are, waking up, checking your phone before checking on anyone else, eating alone in a car, sleeping behind a locked door on a street full of strangers. None of that would have made sense to the people whose blood runs through you. Not because they were simpler than you, because they were held, constantly, by rules you were never taught to see. Rules about sharing, about humility, about staying close, about belief, about being useful to something bigger than yourself. You didn't lose those rules because they stopped working. You lost them because the world got big enough to let you break them and survive anyway. But something in you still remembers. That's why silence feels heavier than it should. That's why eating alone sometimes feels wrong in a way you can't explain. That's why, deep down, some part of you is still checking to see who's around before you sit down to eat. You wake up. And somewhere underneath all of it, the oldest rules are still quietly asking to be followed.